Millions of frontline workers keep our economy running and are provided with the latest technology to do their jobs. But digital adoption, especially by frontline workers, is really hard.
This is Frontline Innovators. We explore how to overcome challenges and achieve success when we empower our essential workers.
I'm Justin Lake.
And I'm Eugene Signorini. Together, we speak with experts who are leading the way and driving digital transformation to the front line.
This podcast is sponsored by Skillful, on a mission to help frontline workers learn and use the technology needed to succeed in their jobs.
Welcome to the Frontline Innovators podcast. I'm your host, Eugene Signorini, and I'm excited for today's episode. Today's guest is a communicator, creator, and connector, a woman who balances it all and truly understands frontline workers. She's former editor-in-chief of Field Technologies Magazine and Field Technologies Online, and is the creator, field service evangelist, and podcast host at The Future of Field Service. She currently serves as Vice President of Customer Advocacy at IFS. So today, we're turning the tables a bit, and the host turns into guest and subject matter expert, and she's most certainly fits the bill in that category. So I'd like to welcome Sarah Nicastro to the show. Sarah, thanks for taking the time today.
Hi, Gene. Thanks for having me.
So
this is definitely a difference for me in being interviewed instead of doing the interview. So,
well, I hope it's an enjoyable experience for you. I'll try to take it easy.
All right.
But I know you've spent an awful lot of time in your career looking at technologies and, more importantly, how technologies impact the front line and frontline workers. And I'd really like to start off by asking you kind of a big picture question, which is, what do you see as the biggest challenge facing the deskless workforce today?
Yeah, well, I think, there's a number of challenges, but I think that they all sort of bubble up to the biggest, which is that there is just an immense amount of change taking place. So if you think about the individual frontline worker themselves, they're caught in sort of this sea of change, whether it's business strategy or technology use or what their role looks like or who they're working alongside. There's a lot of different things at play that all equate to just a lot of evolution in what their day-to-day looks like. And, we know as human beings, change is not always easy. And so while the change may very well be good change, it can still be very challenging.
So let's pull on that string a little bit, because there's probably different elements of change that is happening, right? There's technological change. There's obviously other factors happening, in a post-pandemic world, or if we're even in a post-pandemic world yet. But talk a little bit about what you see as kind of those key factors that are really impacting now.
Yeah, well, I mean, let's touch on the pandemic first, and we'll try and get that out of the way and focus on some of the others. That in and of itself has just been an incredibly taxing time for all of us as human beings. And so, I know that you're looking at frontline workers across a variety of different industries. And so that, impact and what that might have been like varies obviously industry to industry, person to person. But I do think that, business leaders need to keep the perspective of what all of us collectively have gone through as humans, over the last 16, 17 months. And just understand how that compounds this sort of weariness of all of the change, right? It's been a super stressful time, a very emotional time. And so when you combine that with some of the other change factors that are taking place in the workplace that I'll talk about next, it just adds a layer of overwhelm or weariness. So hopefully, to your point, we are moving into the post-pandemic time, and people will recover and heal from that. But I think it is an important point in terms of understanding, how that adds a layer to everything else that's going on. Putting that aside, I think that again, our audience at Future of Field Service is horizontal, so it reaches across a number of industries. So I always try and look at the big picture. But I think regardless of industry, most are in some form of evolution. So whether that's, a manufacturer that's in the midst of servitizing their business, whether it's a pure play service provider that is moving toward, the idea of delivering outcomes instead of transactional service, there's sort of this business model, this strategic shift. And I think that's probably the biggest change factor, in the sense of it directly impacts, in many instances, what the role of the frontline worker is. So, in a service organization where traditionally that person was just responsible for a break fix scenario, and now they might be, evolving to be more responsible for, customer relationships and having, soft skills and things that they're just not used to, that is a big change. The other is obviously technologically, right? As companies continue to digitally transform, there's, new tool after new tool that gets introduced. And in the best case, they're done well and pragmatically and cohesively. And that's still a lot. And in many cases, it's not quite that smooth, and that, also introduces some complexity. So I think those are the big two, and it's compounded by just the pace, right? So the pace of change continues to increase, while all of this is taking place. And if you just think about it from their perspective, it could kind of make your head spin.
Yeah. So what's driving the change? What's driving at least the acceleration of the change among the customers or, people you're talking to in that kind of field service horizontal?
Mm-hmm. Well, the first is just customer expectation, right?
Yep.
So, you hear all the time the examples of Uber and Amazon, and, consumers of things and of services are just quite accustomed at this point to instant gratification, to constant flow of information. And so some of the historical service practices, just seem quite outdated at this point. And so part of what's going on is companies trying to match the level of experience that a customer can get in a consumer environment with, their business. So that's certainly one. And that's driven a lot by technology, right? So, those experiences and those expectations would not be possible if technology hadn't advanced the way that it has. And so, that it's almost like they fuel each other,
Yep.
right? Technology innovates, it shifts and changes the customer expectation. Those expectations get, more demanding, and then, it just kind of continues. And so, I think, I don't want to say the pace is, so fast that people can't catch up and stay caught up, but I think we are at a point where a lot of these businesses are trying to get to that point of creating a modern, business structure and technological foundation so that they can keep pace with the change instead of trying to catch up to the change.
Yeah, it's really interesting. I love how you kind of talked about the cyclical effect of that. And I guess it can be either a virtuous cycle or a vicious cycle, depending on, how you look at it. I guess the virtuous aspect of it is, I think, accelerating how companies are thinking and reacting to their customers, right? Or at least trying to meet those expectations. The vicious cycle of it could be, as you're saying, there's, changes in customer expectations leads to changes in technologies and even, business processes and business practices. And that all comes down on the heads of your frontline workers, right?
Mm-hmm.
So, how well do you think companies are managing that change for the workers themselves?
Well, I think the answer to that question goes back to what you just said, and it's whether they view that cycle as virtuous or as vicious, right? So I think the reaction to the change depends a whole lot on how the leadership of the organization perceives it. Whether they're looking at it as a massive opportunity and something that they can get excited about, something they see as big potential for the business, something that they can articulate into a message to their workforce of, hey, this is great, this is exciting, and here's why you should be pumped. Here's why we need you to bring this to life. And in those situations, even with that perspective, there's still a lot of things that can go awry, right? Because there's a lot of layers of complexity here. And so even with a positive attitude and strong leadership that wants to drive an innovative culture, there's still a lot of hurdles to overcome. For a leader that looks at that as vicious, I mean, you're just really, leading by example with the perspective of, woe is us, this is annoying, frustrating. This is, we just want to do things the way we've always done. It's worked for this long. Why should we need to change? And an attitude like that, will trickle down throughout the business. And so there's enough resistance to change just based on, human nature. When you have leadership that really isn't embracing the opportunity that's being presented, then, that just sort of fuels the fire of that resistance and pessimism. And, it just certainly is not a good thing.
Yeah, it's very interesting because I like how you kind of talked about that, because obviously there's different levels of change management, and we tend to think of change management as kind of the basic blocking and tackling in a lot of ways, which is, how do we effectively roll out technologies? How do we make sure that they work well? How do we make sure people are trained and comfortable with them? But I think you've talked a lot about the other element of it, which doesn't surprise me because you do have a bachelor's in psychology. So you're talking a lot about the psychological aspects and the impacts on those frontline workers as well. And, to me, it seems that that's probably something that is, I mean, I think in general, change management gets overlooked, but certainly the psychological aspects of it, or the anxiety it could potentially cause people, gets overlooked.
Yeah, absolutely. And, change management is a topic that frustrates me because it's been talked about, to death, but it still gets ignored or under prioritized, or, as soon as a budget for an initiative gets cut, that's the first thing that gets, ignored. And so I think there's this discussion of the criticality of change management without, in a lot of cases, a lot of action behind it. And so, I think in so many cases, if companies just viewed change management as an imperative and looked at it a little bit differently, they would set themselves up for so much success. The conversations that I have when companies are struggling or failing at, whether it's a business model change or a technology change, it almost always relates back to buy-in, acceptance, and change management. And so when you just, you don't have to have a bachelor's degree in psychology to understand. If you just take a minute to put yourself in the shoes of the frontline worker, there's a lot of things happening. If you just take technology, for an example, all of the conversation around automation and AI and machine learning, that causes this sense of fear within the workforce that their jobs are going to be taken from them. And so how then would you expect them to react to the introduction of those things, And so I think sometimes business leaders are moving so fast toward a strategy or a vision that they just don't take the time to consider that psychological impact. If you do, and when you can, you understand the fact that a little bit of reassurance in the form of articulating to those frontline workers how they fit into this new world and this new vision can make a world of difference. It's really just letting those folks know that, yes, AI might take this subset of your responsibility and automate it, but that will then give you the latitude to do this new thing or to do these tasks, so it isn't a matter of taking your job. It's a matter of elevating the value that you bring to the business,
Yeah. And that, I think you hit on a very good point, because I think there's this, perhaps too easy of an excuse that people say is, oh, the field is reluctant. They're always reluctant. They're always pushing back on technology. They don't want to learn anything new. But the reality is it comes from a place of anxiety in a lot of ways,
Mhm.
right? And even the notion of redefining someone's job, right?
Mhm.
Even if that could mean greater things, is still something that will cause that anxiety. So
Right.
I do think it's something that we've seen as well. The other thing, Sarah, that we've seen is, it almost seems that in order to get companies become very aware of change management after they've done it
Poorly.
once, and
Or
they're
not
doing
at
it
all.
again, right?
Yeah.
Or what I mean is we've
Yeah.
seen companies who've gone through a major transformation project in the past, and now they're coming back and they're doing a new one or refreshing it, and they've got the battle scars from the
Mhm.
past, right? So the unfortunate thing is, a lot of companies go into it, I think naively,
Mhm.
thinking that they've got all the boxes checked when they don't.
Mhm.
And then the next time around, either the project or the initiative fails, right? And they've got to go back and redo it. Or the next time they go back to refresh, they said, yeah, we've got to figure out a better way to kind of do this.
Mhm. I wanted to just mention, Gene, we talked about anxiety and
Yep.
that being an emotion among frontline workers that folks need to take into consideration. I think the other is frustration in not having their voice valued,
Yep.
right? So I want to think about this a couple ways. So when you look at change management gone wrong, one of the things that commonly gets brought up is that the company didn't do a good enough job getting input and feedback from the front line. Okay. And so if you think about that in the sense of introduction of a new technology, it's fairly straightforward, right? So yes, it would make sense that if they're the ones ultimately using the tool, they should be a part of the process early on. They should be able to help put together the objectives and the checklist of what's necessary. They should be able to provide early feedback. You should, as a leader, you should value that input, because there's no one better equipped to help you get it right the first time, right? But if you look at some of the change that's happening around strategic use of service and business transformation, so whether that's servitization or outcomes-based service, that voice is even more important, because they are often the people that are closest to the customers, right? And so, there's this disregard for this incredibly valuable input that your frontline workforce can provide, either in your technology projects or in your business strategy and development of your new value proposition or new service offerings. And I think that a company's failure to recognize exactly how knowledgeable their frontline is creates this sense of frustration and resentment that certainly doesn't help with a change initiative, right? Because instead of saying, wow, they came to me and asked what I think because they view me as an important resource to the company, as a part of the team, they're left thinking like, well, what the heck, like I'm the one working with the customers every day, and some leader at the top who is dictating, where we're taking the business. And if that's, a centimeter off of what they think it should be, it fuels this sense of just frustration and resentment that then makes them not want to get on board with what's taking place. Right. So I think there's the point of consider how change might create anxiety among your frontline, and make sure that you're communicating early and often why they don't need to be anxious or have fear. but then also understand the value of their voice in the full extent to which it can be leveraged for your business. And the more you can make them feel a part of strategic decisions and the evolution of service offerings and the introduction of technology, the better off you'll be.
Yeah, and that goes back to one of the first points you made, right? Which is what is driving the change is customer expectations. And like you said, I mean, that's why we call them frontline workers, is because they are on the front lines. They're working with customers. And I think, in many ways, these workers are probably wanting more change in some ways because they're the ones who are getting pulled and asked by customers for some of these newer initiatives. So I think your point is dead on. I want to go back. You made a reference to the future of field service, and I mentioned it in your introduction. But I'd love to kind of have you talk a little bit more about what you're doing there, how and why you got it started. The digital platform and the podcast as well. Would just love to hear more about it.
Yeah. So as you mentioned when you introduced me, I spent quite a long time as the editor-in-chief of Field Technologies. And I always tell the story that when I started with Field Technologies, I didn't know what field service was. And then even once I did, I really didn't have a huge intention of sticking around. This wasn't really an industry that I thought I would build a career in. But I think that at the time that I started, and the entire time I've been in this space, the content that I've created is almost entirely interview based, right? So, I mean, for now, 14 years, I've been interviewing service leaders and business leaders daily, right? So it's a lot of perspective on what's happening. And I think that I just started that at a time where there was just a lot of this initial shift and change underway. It was really sort of the beginning of the conversation of perceiving service as a potential profit center instead of a cost center. And I just got hooked. I got really interested in it, and I loved the conversations I was having. And so found myself at Field Technologies for, I think, almost 12 years. And so I was approached by Marnie Martin, who is the president of service management at IFS. And she reached out to me shortly after she joined with this concept of creating what became Future of Field Service. And the idea behind it is that, IFS, who's a software provider in this space, across field service management, asset management, logistics, et cetera, really understood that, service presented a significant opportunity for IFS, but, the level of change and evolution within the community just warrants more than, the standard vendor white paper, if you will, yep. Right? And so it needed a conversation, not just about how does software play a part in this whole puzzle, but the whole puzzle itself, right? And I think the idea was that, we would create Future of Field Service to be a thought leadership platform for the service community in a way that expanded the conversation beyond what a software vendor would typically be discussing. So it's created in partnership with IFS, and it was created from the ground up. I was very, very excited to bring to life the podcast. That was something I had been interested in doing for a long time because, I like to write, but there's a certain pressure of taking a really good interview and articulating that all in a written piece. And so the idea of being able to have conversations that people could be a part of, I thought was really cool. So created Future of Field Service. We publish 2 articles a week and 1 podcast a week. And it's the content looks at sort of, like I said, the bigger picture of all of these things that's happening in service across industries, across the globe. what are some of the major trends and themes? What are the drivers? What are the challenges? And how are companies both triumphing and what trials are they facing, right? As I built Future of Field Service out, I saw this huge opportunity to leverage what was initially created to be a content platform to create more of a community within the IFS customer base. So that's where customer advocacy came into play. And so in addition to running Future of Field Service, I also have a network of about 35 IFS customers that are across the globe, all focused on, better leveraging service within their businesses. And we get together every other week and talk about all sorts of different things. So it's really taking the content platform and using it to build a community where we can build collective knowledge and, they can really help each other along these journeys. And so that's something I enjoy quite a bit as well.
So I think it's great because, the title of our podcast is Frontline Innovators, right? And I think it is, one of the things that I've observed in years working with customers and large enterprise customers is that you are so consumed by your own company and the complexities and the size of that, you don't have that view of what is happening on the outside, either best practices from other companies or the technologies that are available. And I think it takes, that ability to kind of extract a bit from what you're doing in your own world to really kind of to help innovate and co-innovate either in reality or really just collaborate or talking to other people. So I think it's a fantastic platform for that.
Yeah. I was just going to say, I think it's, I would challenge any vendor in this space, right? So, and this is kind of, what I came into IFS with. And I have so much respect for the company for understanding the importance of building something like Future of Field Service and for trusting me to do it. But what I challenged them with from the very beginning is this idea that what you just said is right. It's also true, though, for the vendor community. Yep. So a creator of software, so that's IFS and all of the others, right? I saw this my whole career. Their world is that one piece, right? So that piece can be an instrumental, critical, foundational piece to a customer, but it is still just one piece of the bigger puzzle. And so when you expand your view out to the context of what is happening within these businesses, it gives you incredibly valuable perspective on, what they're up against, and the fact that there is no software in the world that can solve all of these problems. It's a major enabler. It's a critical enabler at this point. But there's so much more to it. And I think that the more the vendor community can expand its own awareness of the context of the business landscape, the better they understand the challenges and objectives that their customers have. And so, that's another thing that we've been able to do with Future of Field Service is just create a resource that not only provides immense value to the service community, but that, IFSers can read the content and just glean this, context and further insight of what the industry is working towards and where companies are going. And to your point, from the customer community standpoint, you're absolutely right. I mean, there's so much feedback that there's nothing more valuable than just being able to set aside a little bit of time from a busy week and sit down with some peers and just have some good conversations. And you never know where the light bulb moments are going to happen that you can take back into your own initiatives and make some big impact.
So you mentioned one of the trends that you've mentioned a couple of times, and I'm sure that you explore in depth in the Future of Field Service is servitization. Am I saying it right? Servitization. Can you expand on that a little bit? Maybe I think some folks in our audience probably aren't familiar with that term or what the implications are or why it's happening.
Sure. So the idea of servitization is really just at the root looking at the role service can play in being a strategic differentiator and a revenue generator for the company. So manufacturing, I think, is the industry in which the term servitization is used the most. And it's the idea of, a company that has historically created, manufactured, and sold products, shifting to being a service business. Okay. And so that doesn't mean tacking on some aftermarket service and trying to incrementally focus a bit more on that, but really redefining the role of the business to be a business that delivers outcomes to its customers. And those outcomes combine both the products it's historically manufactured and a whole host of services that kind of complete that offering. But the idea of servitization is applicable really in any industry. So, when we talk about a service-based business, so we talk more about the evolution of moving toward outcomes-based service. And that's really this idea of customers demanding more, right? So, where it used to be acceptable that, it would be, I need X thing, when can you come install it? Or I have a problem, when can you come fix it? There is a greater expectation for outcome, often guaranteed outcome, guaranteed uptime, or experience, right? And looking at the service aspect of a business as a way to create an experience for customers that sets you apart from your competition.
So, it's kind of funny because unfortunately I had to go to the Apple store yesterday because I'm having a power issue with my Mac. But to be honest with you, the experience, right, of booking a Genius Bar appointment, the interaction with the associates there was actually great. Mm-hmm. And as you were talking about servitization, my first thought went to that just because it's so fresh in my mind. But I also thought about the importance that the associates in the Apple store plays. Like everybody talks about the layout and clean, all that design, the design elements that go into it, but we often forget that the associates are really that touch point, right? And the crux of that experience. So I'd love to kind of twist this back a little bit to say, you talk about servitization and you talk about, okay, if these expectations are changing, right, and we're shifting the mindset of what service can be for our business, then obviously the role of those individuals, the frontline workers servicing customers, changes pretty drastically, I would imagine.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yes, absolutely. And going back to the first question, I mean, that is one of the biggest factors in the sea of change, right? And so I think there's this objective, within the overarching trend. So again, regardless of industry, for the frontline worker to be perceived less as a, Mr. or Mrs. Fix-It, right? Less as someone who just shows up and does this thing and then leaves, and more as a trusted advisor, right? And more as someone that builds a genuine relationship with customers, that engages, that converses, that provides valuable insight, that is, creating a good experience. So the same way that when you walk into the Apple store and you leave, thinking like, oh, that was actually pretty cool. There's no reason that across industries that type of experience shouldn't be provided in the homes of people or in the business settings that some companies might do service in. So what that means, though, is that the demands of the frontline worker, often the personality types of the frontline worker, they're changing, right? And so there's a greater emphasis on soft skills and how important that is. There's this idea that, rather than just being hands-on, they're more insightful to the customers and to the company, right? So we talked about, tapping into that resource of using the frontline to understand what it is your customers want and need, right? So it's a whole change in terms of, what was very much a transactional type role to being something that is a more strategic role, and plays a bigger part in developing relationships and feeding insight back into the business and, creating those experiences.
So now we've got, like you said, we've got this idea of we're kind of changing maybe the profile of our workers, or at least the role, right? And their
Mhm.
responsibilities and how their behaviors in a lot of ways. But at the same time, that is being compounded, right, by an aging workforce in a lot of these industries, by potential labor shortages,
Mhm.
right, that are happening. So how do companies then achieve that goal with all of these other things, coming together?
Mhm.
How do they go and find, so if we take, for example, the existing workforce, right?
Mhm.
How do you kind of train that workforce, right, with a new mindset in a new role, right, becoming more of that strategic advisor? And then
Mhm.
how do you get, additional workers, to kind of backfill as needed?
Mhm. Okay, so there's a list of things I need to bring up, and I'm just trying to make sure I go in order. So the first thing is a recognition that if you are trying to do things differently than you've done before, something has to change, right? So one of the biggest mistakes is that a company has this initiative to, move to outcomes or to create more experiences or to servitize, but they're not changing anything about the frontline worker, right? And so that's a big disconnect, right? So I think the first thing is just an awareness that if the intended outcome is different, that needs to be communicated. It needs to be clear. It needs to be understood. There needs to be training involved. And you have to understand that perhaps not everyone in place is going to be up to that task, right? And so the first thing to talk about is, so how do you make some of that change with your existing workforce? Okay, so like I said, you need to clearly articulate what it is you're looking for and how that might differ from, the historical role. You need to look at willingness and understand, who within your existing workforce is up to the task and who might want to opt out. You need to make sure you're able to set clear expectations for performance, what that looks like, how you'll measure it, and how they'll be compensated if things are really changing. And then you need to provide for the people that are on board, you need to provide them the opportunity to reskill and upskill, right? And so you need to look at training and enablement and all of those things. One of the things that I've seen companies starting to do a bit more as you look at this evolution is starting to kind of tier service work so that you can kind of separate out some of the foundational core break fix transactional type things that still need to get done with some of the more sophisticated soft skills based trusted advisor type things that you're trying to bring into existence. And by tiering that, it allows you to match your existing workforce better to what they might be willing to do. In some instances, I've talked with companies that are focusing on upskilling their existing workforce to be the trusted advisor while outsourcing some of that foundational work that's more transactional to contract workers. And then it also gives you some visibility into what you need to seek, beyond your existing workforce. So then when you shift gears and talk about, so how do we hire, right? So how do we hire new workers that are going to fit the vision for where the company is going? Number one, I think that generally speaking, service organizations are quite lazy when it comes to recruiting. Most of them are accustomed to hiring based on experience. And so they're putting out job postings that, they want 3 years, 5 years, 10 years of experience in that specific industry. And the reality is, I mean, that experience is becoming extinct, right? It's aging out of the workforce. And so we need to become more creative about where we look for the next generation of frontline worker. And so, I think that's the first hurdle, is understanding that you need to start setting yourself up to seek skills and traits and personality fit and be willing to train for experience, versus, expecting that you'll be able to go out and get people in the door that already know what they're doing.
Are you seeing companies making that shift today, or are they still stuck in the old model when thinking about hiring?
I think a lot are still stuck in the old model. I think that, again, this is sort of a layer of complexity that you can introduce a lot of new strategy, and you can start evolving a lot of things before you realize, like, oh, so where are we going to recruit and hire from? And if we're running out of people that just, have experience in this industry, and or we have new role requirements that those people wouldn't fit anyway, then where can we find them? And so I think it's a matter of really understanding. We did a really good podcast with a woman named Bonnie Anderson, who heads recruiting for Tetra Pak. And she talked about this idea of skills-based recruiting. And so part of that is looking into, if you had required X years of experience, you need to be able to translate that into what did you really need? So experience aside, what did that experience give these people that is actually required for the job? And then look for different ways to go out and seek that.
Yeah. So it's looking toward the ultimate attributes we need for these workers. Yeah. How does technology play a role in that upskilling, in helping, accelerate perhaps that knowledge, either knowledge transfer, or, in some cases, not even knowledge transfer. It's just new training and new capabilities. How do you see, because often we see technology being pushed down to the front line that is about, hey, this is stuff you need to know so we can get visibility into what's happening, et cetera, et cetera. But in this case, technology, if I'm listening to you correctly, technology can become a tool in many ways to help accelerate some of that change for those workers.
Right. Yeah. So it's actually the opposite of what you just said. We've thought of technology as a way for us to have visibility into what the frontline is doing. And we really need to think more about leveraging technology to give the frontline visibility into whatever it is they need to know to do what they need to do on site, right? And so a lot of that is, knowledge capture and transfer knowledge management is imperative, right? So there is this issue of, as you have workers retiring, have you captured any of the years and years of experience that they have? And if so, great. How are you leveraging it? If not, how can you do that, right? And making that knowledge available to new workers in a way that is easy to access, easy to put to use, combined with, really easy access into customer history, right? And so you can't have this fragmented visit where, someone shows up, they don't know what the customer did last time. They don't, there's all these unanswered questions. They need to have all of the insights available to them to, to be able to not only resolve a problem, but to seem as knowledgeable as you want them to seem about that customer's, landscape, about being able to maybe make recommendations or have an insightful conversation about, the services you're providing. And so, that customer history and easy access to that data is super important. Knowledge management and being able to easily access and make use of knowledge that can help them on site is important. And the other thing that we've seen companies doing quite a bit is leveraging tools like augmented reality to really speed the pace of getting these new employees, particularly if they don't have prior experience, to the level where, they're comfortable. So maybe you have a situation where you have a technician that is near retirement. They don't really want to be out traveling site to site anymore. And so, perhaps they can sit in a back office or at home and, use augmented reality to hands-on mentor or train, 5, 6, 7 newer folks, right? And so those are just a couple of examples, but there's a lot of ways that it can serve as an enabler to get these employees the knowledge they need to do what needs done on site, which again leads us back to this idea of, if that's true, then if we're not hiring for experience, what are we hiring for? Okay, so if we can find ways to leverage technology to make this knowledge more accessible, to provide sort of hands-on oversight remotely so that, someone can walk them through a transactional fix of something, what are the skills that you need to evolve these relationships to that trusted advisor level? And how is that different than what you've sought in your frontline workforce historically?
Yeah, this is a fascinating discussion because it's definitely a pretty significant mind shift for most companies. It's certainly a complex challenge to solve, but it's one that they are facing and they have to do. So I think it's great. Sarah, before we wrap today, I one of the things we like to talk about on the program is just kind of your pathway and kind of what you've learned. And you alluded to it earlier, right? You kind of started at Field Technologies magazine, when that was just print, right? I'm sure at the time, right? And now, you never thought you'd kind of stay, and now you're a Field Technologies field service expert. So, what have you learned along your pathway, like that can help some of our listeners as they're kind of going through this pathway to innovation?
I think the biggest thing is just the power of being inquisitive, and asking questions, and, seeking not to respond, but to understand. I'm super lucky that a big part of my job is, interviewing people for a podcast and having conversations with folks about their challenges. And there's a lot of power in asking the next layer of question, right? And to really seek to understand, and so relating that to a frontline worker, don't be afraid to speak up. Don't be afraid to ask why. Why are we doing this? Why is this the process? Why are you introducing X, right? And, just recognize the value in your own voice, and understand that we all have, unique perspective and unique gifts that we bring to the table. And, any company is more powerful when it harnesses the unique skill sets of all of its workers and brings that together to really drive innovation. So if you're leading an organization, make sure you understand the importance of everyone's voice. And if you are on the front line, don't be afraid to speak up and speak out, and know the value of your perspective.
Yeah, that's great. So you spent your career at this point probably not intending to, being working in the technology field and surrounded by it. So I like to ask this question of our guests as well, which is, what do you love about working in technology, and what do you hate about it?
I love the fast pace. I think it's really exciting that there's always something new. There's this, huge move toward businesses becoming more agile, and not in terms of software development necessarily, but just in terms of mindset and in terms of being nimble and being adept at, adjusting to different situations and circumstances. And I find that really interesting and exciting. I think what I hate about it, and it probably goes back to my psychology roots, is that technology is not that powerful on its own, right? And so all too often it is put on a pedestal as the be all and end all to some of these problems or challenges. And, there can be a disregard for all of the other things culturally, psychologically, individually, that come into play to really have it make its intended impact. And so that's why I like to talk about those things.
That's awesome. And so I think this is probably a good place to wrap up, Sarah. But before we do, I'd love to, where can people hear the podcast and find the future of field service stuff?
Yeah. So futureoffieldservice.com is the website. That's where the articles are posted. The podcasts live there. They're also available on any of the major podcast platforms. You would just search Future of Field Service. We have a LinkedIn page, so check us out there and follow along. And obviously anyone can connect with me on LinkedIn as well.
That's awesome. And definitely check that out. That's some really good stuff. Great content on there. Sarah, really appreciate you joining today. This has been a great conversation. I'm sure we could keep speaking for another 45 minutes ongoing, and maybe we'll speak again soon. So again, thank you so much for sharing your thoughts with our audience today.
Thanks for having me, Gene. It was a pleasure.
So I hope you found this conversation as enjoyable as I have. If so, please share and rate the podcast. 5-star ratings help ensure that it gets promoted to other professionals like you that are innovating on the front lines. And just a reminder that this podcast is sponsored by Skillful, the mobile digital adoption platform for deskless and frontline workers. You can visit the Skillful website at skillful.com. That's SKYLLFUL.com. And if you or someone you know is out there innovating on the front lines, we'd love to hear about it. Please reach out to me on LinkedIn and share your story. See you on our next episode.